In this talk, I'm going to discuss the ways in which Britishness is translated. As it's not entirely clear what that might mean, I'll be thinking about what Britishness means and why how it's translated is something worth considering, before moving on to more concrete examples, and how they have been translated or how they escape translation. So what is Britishness? It might be the features of film that make it feel British as opposed to American or Australian. This comparison is not accidental. Forms of national identity are constructed in relation to other national identities. Britishness can only be thought of in relation to Americanness or Frenchness, or in relation to some other form of national identity. The elements and characteristics of Britishness are identifiable as such in relation to elements and characteristics of another nationhood. In isolation, they are not meaningful. It's only through comparison that they delineate what it makes something British, rather than from anywhere else. There is not, therefore, any essentially British things. The signs of Britishness can change over time and are understood as part of a system of signs. Further complications come from positional perspectives. From inside Britain, Britishness may be identified by certain elements, markers of class or regional accents for instance, that may not be meaningful outside of Britain. Indeed, within Britain, Britishness itself is likely to be called into question by more local identities, for example, Welshness, Scottishness or Englishness, and each of these can become more localised, Northernness and Southernness in England, for instance. Once again, all of these positions exist in a relational system and are not in themselves essential characteristics. To an extent, we can see here the nation as an imagined community, as Benedict Anderson described it. Being part of Britain requires imagining what Britain is, and the sorts of shared characteristics that make it into a nation. Another way of saying this might be to say that it's telling the story of what it means to be British. The social theory of narrative, which focuses on the way in which we understand the world through stories in both the literal and metaphorical sense, was introduced into translation studies by Mona Baker in her book Translation and Conflict. As Baker argues, translators can alter and affect narratives, including narratives of nationhood. Filmmakers can also help create these narratives by choosing what is and what is not represented, the locations and the lives depicted in the films. As cultural theorist Ray Chow has argued, film can effectively translate a nation for its viewers, creating an image or narrative of that nation that viewers relate to. While Britishness is not fixed then, it is visible in a range of elements in the film, and these elements can be differentiated from the markers of national identity for other nations. This is starting to hint at why the translation of Britishness is important to consider. There is a tendency in translation to flatten out difference, as Antoine Berman argued way back in the 1980s. But difference is sometimes precisely why we're interested in a film. We often choose to watch foreign films because they show something different from local cinema, giving us a glimpse of other ways of life. The Anglophone category of world cinema is problematic for the way it lumps together films from a vast range of locations, which have quite significant differences between them. For example, a film from India comes with a very different historical and cinematic context than a film from Italy, but both would be world cinema. While it's true that there are a number of globally circulating films that many filmmakers and viewers would be familiar with, there is not quite one single world cinema. Emily Apter's polemical criticism of world literature, which argues that the way in which world literature taught in American universities erases national and cultural differences, seems equally important when discussing world cinemas. Watching cinema from different locations around the world requires some sensitivity to the different cultures and contexts in each of these locations. As I shall discuss, some of these elements can be mediated by translators. Others are not verbal, and others still need forms of mediation that are not a traditional part of interlingual translation, which still tends to be the defining characteristic of translation, but which could be understood as an extended part of translation. After this quite theoretical introduction, what I want to do now is to discuss features of Britishness that I can identify in British queer cinema, and discuss how they pose problems for translation, and how they might be translated in such a way that they are both intelligible and respect the differences inherent between Britishness and other cultures. At the same time, I think it's worth noting that not everything needs to be understood by everyone, and given the shift to home viewing and watching with another device, such as a phone or tablet in your hands at the same time, people can and do look things up as they are watching films. The areas that seem obvious for discussion for me are accent and dialect, class, settings and landscape, and cultural references. Some of these overlap somewhat, but I'm separating them here for clarity and ease of understanding. I'll begin with landscape and setting, as this is the area that is least likely to be translated linguistically. It might seem obvious to say, but British cinema will be set in British locations. That said, there is a wide variety of possible locations within Britain, and different cultural connotations attached to each place. It's very different to set something in Manchester's gay village, as the original series of Queer as Folk was, than to set a film in the Yorkshire countryside, as God's Own Country was. Even though there's no more than 100 miles between these two locations, there's a significant difference in meaning for LGBT audiences. One is a metropolitan area that is relatively tolerant, while the other is more rural, making queerness more complex, as there are fewer people to discuss it with than in bigger cities. But beyond this difference between the rural and the city, which has been critiqued in recent queer theory by scholars such as Jack Haberstam and Scott Herring, there are also more regional differences. The film The Last Great Wilderness plays on the metropolitan English perception of the Scottish Highlands, for instance. There are also significant differences in meaning between Scottish, Welsh, and English locations, which might be erased by using the term British to refer to all of them. Setting is also important. The small flats, clubs, and suburban semi-detached houses of Weekend are all indicative of British ways of life. Just as people in American films hang out in diners, people in British films end up in the pub. This is parodied in Shaun of the Dead, where the pub is the place Shaun takes his girlfriend on a date, where he goes to drown his sorrows after the breakup, and also the place he thinks is safest from zombie attack. These settings and locations cannot be translated linguistically. They're visually there on screen and are seldom expressed in words. Yet there is a slippage in meaning when viewed from outside. What do these spaces mean if you're not familiar with them? In many ways, they indicate Britishness. The pub is an institution that international visitors have commonly heard of, but they have to be approached with an understanding that they may mean different things to visually similar features of other countries. Accent, dialect, and slang are much more obvious issues for linguistic translation and have been explored in the relevant translation studies literature. The problem is that there is no simple way to translate them, nor even simple ways to approach them. For example, if a film is set in Edinburgh and everybody speaks with an Edinburgh accent, it isn't all that important to highlight this in the translation. So, for instance, in Weekend, almost everyone has a Midlands accent, which is noticeable only as it's not a common accent to hear on screen, but it's not important in terms of the narrative. In Beautiful Thing, characters have London accents, but again, this is not important within the narrative itself. As such, most translators would ignore the accent due to the fact that the effort to replicate it or its effects is far more than the benefit of doing so. The times when accent and dialect matter is when they're used within the narrative to mark difference. So the use of foreign accented English by Georga in God's Own Country is noticeable, while it might not be in a film focusing on immigrant workers in the UK. In these cases, translators need to work out how to show difference without caricaturing the speaker. In many cases, markers of foreignness are enough to suggest that foreignness. Sometimes, it might be enough to say in the subtitles that they have an accent, as happens in subtitles for the hard of hearing. Finally, the category of cultural references poses a problem for translation. Films, just like other cultural texts, make reference to events, people, texts, and other items that are common in the culture that they're made in, but may not be so common for people outside. Some of these may be something as simple as songs, which play in the background and which can be translated in subtitles, although they are not always. Or there can be more complex references made to legislation and issues at the time, such as the discussion of same-sex marriage in Weekend. That was a lively debate when the film was made, but it became law shortly afterwards. Other works, such as Derek Jarman's films, may reference historical figures who are unfamiliar outside of the UK, such as Edward II. In some cases, these references can be translated as headnotes, as some Japanese anime subtitling uses. But at the same time, some references are themselves opaque to British viewers, and to understand them require time and effort to find out what they mean. Making them too clear also changes the way the film is perceived. Not everything needs to be clear to everyone. To conclude then, many of the things that make British film British are not easily translatable. They rely on being seen as different from text from other places, or they're encoded visually, or they rely on cultural knowledge that has to be acquired, for British viewers as much as for anyone else. Yet this talk has also suggested that the films themselves translate Britishness for international viewers, and learning to read those British elements in an open way, seeing them for signifiers of local meaning and local practices, can help understand better the narratives of lives in Britain and how they differ from elsewhere, but also how they often share similar stories, even if the setting is different.